Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we focus on a new book by Nancy Foner, Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Hunter College in the City University of New York's Graduate Center, entitled "One Quarter of the Nation, Immigration and the Transformation of America," published earlier this month by Princeton University Press. And joining us this afternoon as a discussant is Susan Martin, the Donald G. Herzberg Professor Emerita of International Migration in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center, who cannot be with us today. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly in pre-COVID times in person at the Wilson Center, and since the pandemic, well, here in the virtual realm. For those who like to plan ahead, we have many additional sessions on our calendar running through late May. Behind the scenes are two individuals who make these seminars possible: Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. We always like to thank our institutional supporters, the George Washington University Department of History, as well as a number of other individual donors. And as I say, every week, we invite you to join their ranks. On the logistics front, please note today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom, not the chat function. And to those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to Rachel Wheatley at rwheatley@historians.org. We will call on as many folks as we can. And it is now my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's featured speaker, Nancy Foner, the Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Hunter and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She has written extensively about immigration in the United States in the past and in the present. And she's the author or editor of some 20 books, among them From Ellis Island to JFK, New York's Two Great Waves of Immigration, published by Yale University Press in 2000, In a New Land, A Comparative View of Immigration, NYU Press, 2005, and 1 out of 3, Immigrant New York in the 20th Century, Columbia University Press, 2013. Nancy Foner, welcome to the Washington History Seminar. The Zoom room is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Eric, for the introduction. Thank you so much for inviting me to present a talk, and to of course, to Susan Martin for being willing to come and comment on the book and add her voice to the discussion. So I want to use this time just to give a sense of the book and the main themes of the book and the points that I make. The book is about, clearly, immigrants' impact on this country. That's the theme of the book. And it's become so much a part of daily life in this country that we sometimes fail to see it. But that's deceptive, because the changes in the years since 1965 have been far-reaching and profound. Indeed, it's fair to say that they've transformed large portions of our institutions and our culture. The numbers alone are extraordinary. And, I write about this and I know the figures, but every time I say them, I think once again how extraordinary they are. By 2020, an unprecedented 45 million immigrants were living in the US, the largest numbers since census records have been kept. Together with their children, they totaled nearly 86 million, accounting for 26% of the nation's population, more than 1/4 of the country, which is where the title of the book comes from. It's the equivalent of absorbing the entire population of Germany and then some. Up to now, however, much of the discussion of contemporary immigration's impact, especially in many scholarly disciplines like my own, which is sociology, has focused on how it's changed the lives of immigrants. Now, obviously, that's very important, and I've actually written a lot about that myself. But I take a different approach in this book, focusing on how another very critical part of immigration's impact, which is how immigration has transformed American society and culture. And I give a big picture views through a national perspective, and also examine a number of key economic, political, social, and cultural domains. So let me start by talking about race. Few things have changed the country's racial picture more conspicuously than the last 50 years of immigration. For much of the 20th century, race was mainly a matter of Black and white. If we go back to 1960, which is 5 years before this, the 1965 immigration law, which had such a dramatic change on the immigrant population in the US, if we go back to 1960, fully 85% of Americans were white. When most Americans thought of minorities then, they had Black people in mind. Hispanics, again, this is in 1960, were a mere 3.5% of the US residents, and Asians were barely visible at less than 1%. Today, whites and non-Hispanic whites alone have shrunk to around 60% of the population. Hispanics at 19% have become the largest minority group, and Asians are 6%. While about the same percentage of Americans are Black, almost a tenth are immigrants, with the overwhelming majority from Africa and the Caribbean. And this in turn has led to astonishing changes in the composition of some of our largest cities. Even in cities that have fairly large and substantial Hispanic populations, the numbers have exploded in the last half century, owing to immigration and to births. The city of Los Angeles went from less than 10% Hispanic in 1960 to nearly half by 2019. Miami-Dade County is in a class all by itself. It's now a Latino global metropolitan giant, 69% Hispanic in 2019, up from about 5% in 1960. Altogether, if we look across the US and US central cities, by 2010, nearly a quarter of the residents were Hispanic, up from 3% in 1970. And the proportion in the suburbs has mushroomed as well. In the South, the old Black-white binary is being altered by growing Hispanic as well as Asian inflows. Asian Americans have not only grown by leaps and bounds in cities like New York and Los Angeles with their old but relatively small Chinatowns in the past, but Asian Americans have multiplied in areas where they were hardly present a half century ago. Houston, Las Vegas, Orlando, Minneapolis, just to name a few. Also striking is the decline of all white neighborhoods in metropolitan areas, a development in which immigration has played a significant role. In a study of neighborhoods in 24 highly diverse metropolitan areas in the year 2000, only a quarter of the more than 1,200 neighborhoods that had been all white in 1980 remained all white in 2000. And it wasn't just, by the way, that they had now a few non-whites. It's that they had, many of them had very substantial Asian and Hispanic populations. Immigration has also had a role in the big growth in mixed marriages, since a great many involve second generation Hispanics and Asian Americans, who in addition are producing a growing number of multiracial children. And by second generation, I mean US-born children of immigrants. Immigration has not only created a new demographic reality, but it's also altered how Americans think about race. East Asians, once considered the yellow peril in a common popular view, have now become the model minority, even though, as spiking hate crimes during the pandemic remind us, they are still subject to racial prejudice and discrimination. Immigration has changed the very words we use to talk about race. In the very category Hispanic is a modern day invention, rarely used 50 years ago, now an established category of identity among non-Hispanics, as well as many with origins in Latin America, along with the category Latino, and most recently Latinx. Now, immigration is not the only factor, of course, in these changes, but it's a very significant one. While systemic racism against Black people is all too persistent, immigrants, in the sociologist Todd Hamilton's phrase, are remaking Black America. now about 10% of Black America, and with their children, around a fifth. So it's very substantial. There's a greater awareness among many Americans, both Black and non-Black, of ethnic or national origin differences within the Black population, especially in cities where Black immigrants have become a significant presence. And this includes the New York and Miami areas. Those are the two areas that have by far the largest Black immigrant populations, but also places like Minneapolis and Lewiston, Maine, where Africans are highly visible drivers of increases in the overall Black population. And African immigration has really, it's really grown since the 1990s, made mostly due to refugees and the diversity visa program, which opened up the ability for many to come. And of course, they sent for their relatives. And immigration has affected how the white majority sees itself. Although whites of European origin are still associated with privilege in the US and often take their white identity for granted, many whites have become increasingly aware of themselves as one racial group in an increasingly diverse America. Around a fifth of white Americans, according to some evidence, have not just become more conscious of their whiteness, but also feel that whites' dominant position is under threat. In part, there are other factors too, but in part owing to the decline in the proportion of whites, as well as economic, political, and occupational gains of non-white groups. Another domain where immigration has had a huge impact is electoral politics. For one thing, immigrant origin voters have helped transform both the Democratic and Republican electoral coalitions. As late as 1980, more whites in the US identified as Democrats than as Republicans, but by 2010, it was the reverse. White Republicans substantially outnumbered white Democrats. At the same time, the Democratic Party has increasingly become a party supported by non-whites. By 2019, according to a Pew Research Center national survey, racial minorities made up 40% of registered voters who identified with or leaned toward the Democratic Party. Immigration has been pivotal in these changes. And again, we can maybe discuss this later. It's not, of course, the only factor, but it has been a critical factor. On one side, it has been critical in the large growth in the share of minority registered voters in the national electorate, from 15 to 30% between 1996 and 2019, and racial minority voters tend to vote Democratic. In Asian and Hispanic voters, for example, in the last 4 presidential elections, 2/3 or more voted Democratic. On the other side, many whites, especially non-college educated whites, have been drawn to the Republican Party and its anti-immigrant and anti-minority appeals, motivated in part by anxiety, fears, and resentments that millions of overwhelmingly non-white newcomers will undermine the national identity and marginalize and disadvantage whites. In the context of these racial fears and resentments, immigration has emerged as a major focus of political debates and campaigns, another change in the realm of politics. Overt anti-immigrant rhetoric became a staple in the strategies of many Republican leaders, most notably, of course, Donald Trump, who gave it a legitimacy in political discourse at the highest levels as he sought to mobilize his core constituency. Who can forget shithole countries, chants of build the wall and Mexico will pay for it, or the Chinese virus? In a kind of feedback loop, Trump's core supporters' enthusiastic response to his anti-immigrant discourse led to a further emphasis on it as a way to energize his following. Trump, as some historians say, was the most anti-newcomer president in all American history, but since he's left office, anti-immigrant politics remains alive and well in the Republican Party. A number of elected Republican politicians and right-wing media personalities, Tucker Carlson, prominent among them, have capitalized and intensified white resentments, promoting the view that native-born white Americans are deliberately being replaced by immigrants and pro-immigrant democratic policies in order to reduce whites' political power. On the whole, however, immigration has brought enormous benefits as it's created far-reaching changes, something evident we look at cities and towns across the country. Immigrants, by their sheer numbers, have provided a lifeline in many cities that were losing population, including my own city of New York, played a key role in the growth of places like Las Vegas and Orlando that were becoming major metro areas for the first time, and revitalized many far-flung rural communities, slowing population loss, and in some cases, even leading the population to grow. In many central cities, immigration helped deteriorating neighborhoods make a comeback by lifting population and spurring economic growth. And immigration was a factor behind the decline in violent crime in urban America from the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. When it comes to the economy, immigration has fostered innovation, fueled growth, and helped to shape the development of whole industries. Immigrants practically invented Silicon Valley. They've had an outsized role in high tech, now one of the national economy's largest components, starting and running major new companies and spearheading innovations in them. Think Google's Russian-born co-founder, Sergey Brin, to mention one name or another, eBay's founder, Pierre Omidyar, born in France to Iranian migrant parents. In 2018, over half of the 91 US startup companies valued at $1 billion or more had at least one immigrant founder, and more than 80% of these companies employed immigrants in key management or product development roles, commonly as chief technology officers and vice presidents of engineering. Immigrants have spurred the formation of other businesses as well, giving many a new character and pioneering new types of enterprises. Just to mention, for example, nail salons are one, Chinese, Asian American supermarket chains, and again in New York, my own city, West Indian dollar vans that ply the streets of Brooklyn and Queens, offering cheaper and more convenient services than city buses. Nationwide, 1 in 5 business owners in 2014 were immigrants, and they founded about a quarter of new firms. Immigrants have helped any number of service industries grow and flourish, filling essential roles at every occupational level, from picking crops to repairing houses. And during the pandemic, became very clear how essential immigrant workers were in nursing homes, in driving vans that delivered our packages, as clerks in supermarkets, in pharmacies. They've reduced shortages in medical and healthcare professions. 28% of the nation's physicians and servants and surgeons, not servants, physicians and surgeons are immigrants, and 16% of registered nurses are immigrants. And they've filled jobs and driven up demand in a number of low-wage occupations, including child and elder care, because the millions of immigrants themselves use services and consume goods. They boosted the economy and job growth, including in an array of public services. In cities like New York, which have so many, New York has over 3 million immigrants, with immigrants, the schools are very crowded. So that we have overcrowded schools in New York City. But without immigration of the post-65 period, schools would be closing. And that would mean, among other things, the loss of jobs. So we would need fewer teachers, there would be fewer opportunities for custodians and janitorial staff, or people serving food or bus drivers taking students to school. So that leads to the next question, which is, have immigrants hurt Native workers, which is a big question in the economic literature. Overall, the consensus among economists is not much, because immigrants increase demand for goods and services, and also because immigrants, small firms, and startups often generate opportunities for Native-born workers, and because highly educated immigrants boost local productivity. The overwhelming consensus among economists is that immigration's adverse effect on US-born workers' wages and employment have taken overall been minimal. Lastly, immigrants are invigorating and indeed remaking what we think of as our uniquely American culture, the foods we eat, the music we listen to, the books we read, the films we watch. If earlier Jewish and Italian immigrants brought us bagels and pizza, today salsa outsells ketchup and tacos are standard fare. In 2015, Chinese restaurants in the US outnumbered all the Kentucky Fried Chickens, McDonald's, and Burger Kings combined, and they have brought include a broad range of regional dishes and cuisines. Whether dining at a high-end restaurant, getting a bite at a fast food restaurant, or buying groceries in the supermarket, immigration has added new tastes to our cuisine. Immigrants and the second generation are new authors on bestseller lists. You only have to look at the New York Times book review every week to see this. Two of the most well-known, Junot Diaz and Jhumpa Lahiri, who both won Pulitzer Prizes for their novels, respectively, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde and The Namesake. Not only do second generation and immigrant writers highlight perennial immigrant themes, like adjusting to American society and culture, but also contemporary issues such as undocumented status. And the same goes for films and TV programs with immigrant and second generation stars, writers, and producers. Yes, they are still underrepresented, but they are making a mark. Two examples: the award-winning TV comedy series Ugly Betty, with its Latino producer and cast, and star who was a second generation Honduran, and a film like The Big Sick, a romantic comedy focusing on South Asian arranged marriage, well, actually really semi-arranged marriage, with a Pakistani-born star and co-writer Kumail Nanjiani. Immigrants and the second generation have taken popular music in new directions. Pop music superstars with roots in Latin America have brought Latin rhythms fused with American popular music to mainstream audiences. One of the best known is Cuban-born and Miami-based Gloria Estefan. Caribbean immigrants have introduced the sounds of Jamaican reggae, Dominican merengue, and Cuban salsa, and played a major role in the creation and development of hip hop, which is often thought of as an African-American invention, but it was not just African-Americans who developed it, but also Afro-Caribbeans and Latinos. Among the recent rap celebrities are Nicki Minaj, born in Trinidad, and Rihanna from Barbados. At one and the same time, immigrants and the US-born second generation have broadened mainstream American culture while also creating new mixtures that blend aspects of American and immigrant cultures. So immigration, to conclude, has profoundly changed America. I've only touched on some of the themes of the book. Obviously, I go into it in much more, these aspects and others in much more detail, and also bring out much more of the complexity of how the changes have been made, why, and their consequences. And looking ahead, more changes are in store as new arrivals settle in this country, as we can certainly expect that they will, and as millions of the US-born second generation grow up and enter adulthood. The meaning of racial and ethnic categories, just to mention one example, is likely to change as more children and grandchildren of post-65, 1965 immigrants move into the upper ends of the occupational hierarchy, and the proportion of mixed marriages and multiracial children grows. We'll see changes in other spheres too, linked to immigration, including in the world of politics, as racial minorities become a larger part of the electorate. Immigration, in short, has been, and no doubt will continue to be, a major element in the evolution of American society and culture. Our growth as a nation, the historian Oscar Handlin wrote more than 60 years ago, has been achieved in large measure through the genius and industry of immigrants of every race and from every quarter of the world. Their brains and their brawn help to build our industries, to develop our commerce, to produce new inventions, and in general, to make us the nation that we now are. The millions and the many millions of immigrants who have arrived since Handlin wrote these words have driven additional and fundamental changes And so if there is a final lesson to be learned, it's that understanding these transformations is and should be a key part of our analysis of immigration's enormous impact, as it has served as a building block of the nation and is bound in the years ahead to continue to mold and remold our society in new and sometimes unexpected ways. So thank you very much. And that's a brief summary of the book. And I guess I now pass it on to Susan.
Thank you so much. Just a quick word to those who are on this Zoom webinar. You can feel free to use the raise hand function and get in the queue to ask your question. We already have a number of people who are posing questions with the Q&A function, but the invitation is open. Please get in line should you wish to do so. And now our discussant. Susan Martin is the Donald G. Herzberg Professor Emerita of International Migration in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She was the founder and director of Georgetown's Institute for the Study of International Migration. Prior to joining Georgetown's faculty, she was the executive director of the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform, which was mandated by statute to advise the President and Congress on U.S. immigration and refugee policy. She received her PhD in the history of American civilization from the University of Pennsylvania. And she's authored or edited a dozen books and numerous articles and book chapters on international migration, refugees, and internally displaced persons. Her most recent publication is A Nation of Immigrants, the second edition of which appeared in 2021, published by Cambridge University Press. Welcome, Dr. Martin.
Thank you very much. And I have to give my great thanks to Nancy and my congratulations, of course, on producing this book. I think it makes an extremely valuable contribution to the literature on American immigration or immigration into the United States. And the fact that she's chosen this path of looking at the impact on our social, cultural, political life in the country makes for an important addition to the way in which we think about these issues. I agree with her completely that much of the focus in the extant literature is on the impact of immigration on immigrants. And also a second area that I think is not quite equally as large in volume, but somewhat related to the themes that Nancy was raising, has been the evolution of U.S. policy on immigration and how that develops. That's the area I work in the most systematically. But getting back to the themes of this book, it's organized as Nancy has just said, along a number of different dimensions and looking at the racial, social, economic, political transformations in the United States. I particularly like the chapter on cultural and social impacts and the whole idea of looking at the cultural changes that have arisen. We all talk about it, but I've not seen it laid out in the same way and with as much detail and very familiar examples of saying, oh yeah, as I was reading it. I, by the way, really hope that that Princeton puts this out as a paperback as soon as possible and electronic form, because I think it's not only useful for the academic community, but I think it's also something that the members of the public would benefit from tremendously in understanding. And I've been thinking of how to introduce it to the book club that I belong in, because I think it's in such a succinct and very great depth in understanding these changes. And the way in which Nancy has interwoven the history, particularly the immigration of the turn of the 19th to 20th century, with what is happening today and drawing out the parallels as well as the differences, I think it also makes it a great contribution. it reminded me certainly, and a lot of my work deals with this, is the extent to which many of the same themes have arisen over time, and the same things that are being said about immigrants today were said about immigrants when in previous waves of immigration into the United States. And I think it very often we as a country see the past immigration through rose-colored glasses. We forget what occurred at that point and find all of the problems with immigration, and have little interest in understanding the similarities, but also the benefits of immigration. This book really pulls it out. The book also talks about, in some detail in the introduction, about undocumented migration, and comes back to those themes throughout. I don't know that the introduction that you gave, Nancy, quite explained that. It's not just looking at people who come in through our legal channels. It's also explaining the roles that undocumented or regular migrants are playing. I think the chapter on the racial and ethnic identification of the country is probably the most important given today's developments. And it's an excellent review of the literature. And again, talking about how at the 120 years ago, we were thinking about, or 100 years ago, we were thinking about race, and the groups like the Jewish immigrants, Italian immigrants, Greek immigrants were thought to be of a different race, and how they evolved to become white, I think is very important in thinking about how we'll be dealing with race in the coming years as immigrants become more accepted and adapting, and have adapted into the U.S. Social system, which itself has been evolving to as a result of their views. I think, Nancy, though, you're probably a little bit more optimistic than I am, although the book is, I think, trying to be quite realistic in looking at these issues. And partly because as the daughter of an immigrant who came in that earlier period of immigration and who is Jewish, seeing the extent to which anti-Semitism has continued to be seen in this country and is still a rallying cry of white supremacy and nationalism, I think is a cautionary tale that I think that eliminating that type of reaction, that even groups that are become white are not necessarily white in the same way that others are, I think is a cautionary tale. I think looking forward, I think the real issue is thinking about how we get out of the current political impasses that we have when it comes to immigration. If we can agree that there are many, many economic, social, cultural benefits, there is still very, very strong opposition to any type of immigration reform, particularly reforms that are aimed at regularizing the status of undocumented, and being able to, this literature indicates that once people have legal status, they contribute even more. And the transformation, I think, increases. We saw that after the legalization program in 1986, as people's wages went up, school performance improved, things of that sort. So I guess my question to you, and Eric, suggested that I ask a question to get the discussion going, is that given that you've really demonstrated the extent to which immigration has been a benefit to the country, and that we're transforming in some very, very positive ways, along with some of the negative trends that are mentioned in the book and that I highlighted. But given that, how do we break the impasse to be able to adopt the kinds of laws and put in place the types of programs that we need that will allow the country to benefit even more. You mentioned in the book that it was the almost complete closing of immigration from the mid-1920s to 1965 that allowed for some of the integration and of the immigrants who had come previously. I hope that's not the way in which we deal with it today. So I just like to pose as a question for all of us, how do we overcome what are seem to be such deep political divides today with one party trying to win on the back of some pretty xenophobic and racist positions to gain the most benefits out of immigration, as you have described them. So why don't I end there with that really big question and turn it back to both of you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Nancy?
Oh my gosh, I wish I had an answer, Susan, for how to break the impasse. I'd be like a genius, right? I'd be a political consultant. But I do want to say the undocumented, and I see someone in the chat group has also raised the issue of undocumented immigrants, but I mean, that's the biggest issue. I mean, how to get a legalization program through, right? Because that has to go through Congress, and, it's hard to get anything going through Congress. But there's also another issue about, future immigration in general, right? Because it's not just undocumented immigration, which I'll come back to in a minute, but, under Trump, as you've written about and as others have written, there were attempts to slash lawful permanent immigration. I mean, Trump certainly was trying to do that through the public charge rule, right? And to try to slash a particular type of low-income immigration, but to cut it back because feeling that, for whatever the reason, and we can discuss, they're trying to cut that back. There are certain demographic pressures, though, that I think are going to operate against that. One is the retirement of the demographics of the retirement of the baby boomers. By 2030, all of the baby boomers will be 65 and older. They're retiring. There's going to be a need for workers. And because at the same time that they're retiring, fertility rates have gone down. They're way below replacement level. So the question is, who is going to do a lot of the jobs, particularly jobs that many native-born Americans shun? Now, it's true they could resort to temporary worker programs for some of this, right? So it could be not as much lawful permanent resident migration. And then actually you get the problem, we know that temporary worker programs often lead to permanent, a more undocumented workers, as the European situation, case very dramatically illustrates. The guest workers came to be, they stayed, many of them remained. So, I mean, but I think there will be continued immigration in one way or another. I don't know about how we get to legalization. I really, really don't, particularly in the short run when the Republican Party continues to use immigration as a way to motivate a segment of the white voting population. And as we know, from demographic projections, non-college educated whites, who are a very important base of the Republican Party, will still be a very significant portion of the electorate for a considerable time to come. They have relatively high turnout rates. That this is a question of politics. At the same time, the proportion of minority voters, racial minority voters, will probably rise as well. And although there has been some defection of Hispanics, as many have, to the Republican Party, we know that when Trump got about 10% more of Hispanic votes between 2016 and 2020, and there is a fear of defection of the Hispanic vote, many Hispanic voters, for various reasons, on social reasons, abortion issues, and as many immigrants and their children become more successful, some of them may move to the Republican Party, but still, the growth of the immigrant population and racial minority population And also the fact that we know that the younger generations of all Americans tend to be more liberal, especially on diversity issues, than older people. So maybe there's some hope in that direction in terms of changing nature of the electorate. We have to look ahead. I did want to say, if I could just say one thing about undocumented, because there was a question about that, and I gave a lot of statistics, but I didn't talk about the undocumented. So there are two things. One is that the undocumented are a quarter of the immigrant population. There are 10 to 11 million undocumented people in the United States. So that's number one. And when I give this figure of 45 million includes those, okay? It includes those undocumented individuals. So I did want to indicate that, right? It comes up in the book, obviously, undocumented people who are undocumented cannot vote, right? They have no access to citizenship. They cannot vote. Their children who are born in the US will be able to vote, but they themselves cannot vote. So in terms of their role in electoral politics, they don't really have one as a direct role in electoral politics. I also, as we know from many, many studies, that the undocumented are very, very disadvantaged in the labor market. They tend to have the worst jobs, low pay, worse, bad conditions, dangerous often conditions. They're very vulnerable in the labor market. And of course, they're vulnerable to deportation. I do discuss that in the book, and we can talk about it more. People may have more specific comments, but they are part of the immigrant population. I should say one more thing is that the undocumented population is increasingly a settled population. And 2/3 of adult undocumented immigrants have been here for 10 years or longer. So they have, in the past, immigrants were more likely to go back and forth, but for various reasons, they have become more, partly because of the expense and the danger of crossing the border. They're here longer, and they've become a settled population, but a settled population that lacks basic rights. And and so it is very concerning. And Susan has raised that, of course, but how do we change that? I don't have an answer.
Thank you very much. So we now open this up to those who are watching. We have a number of hands raised, and the first of those is Sharon Jarrett. We would ask that you unmute yourself and pose your question directly. Sharon. If you would unmute yourself. All right. We can come back to you if your hand is still up. Julia Preston is next in the queue.
Hello.
Hello there.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you for this very insightful book. The last time we had a major surge in nativist politics in the United States in the 1920s, it led to racially based immigration categories that the nation didn't really unwind for 40 years. And I'm wondering, the politics of President Trump and this surge of nativism that we've seen in the last 4 years, how do you think about that? Is that an anomaly, or are we likely to be wrapped up in the same nativist politics for a decade or more to come?
Gee, well, thank you, Julia. I mean, we keep seeing nativism all the time in American society. It's nothing new, not just in the 1920s. Well, I think it depends on what happens and who gets into power in the next election. I mean, if Trump runs again and gets elected, we may see, the return of the policies that he was trying to implement in terms of cutting severely back on immigration. I know Stephen Miller returns to the scene, right? It's very hard to predict. I think what will happen in the future. in terms of whether we'll see that kind of attempt. I mean, look what the Republican Party now is appealing to, certainly to race and racial issues seem to be on the table, right, for the next election. Critical race theory, right, which is really, I'm sure there'll be anti-immigrant attempt, will be used. Tucker Carlson is talking about replacement theory, right? I think, I think we're going to see more nativism from the Republican Party in attempt to get elected. I think they see that that's the way they can get elected. So to the extent that that happens in the near term, there's always the near term and the long term. In the long term, there are pressures that will reduce it. But I'm sort of pessimistic in the near term. I know, Susan, I look to Susan, who looks at policy actually much more than I do, right? She analyzes policy in her work.
Well, I think the bright spot is that public opinion measured by the Gallup polls and others are actually fairly positive about immigrants today in comparison to earlier periods, when the even much larger percent of the population were negative about immigration. And if you go the next step and talk about and ask opinions about discrete immigration policies, including legalization, you get also fairly positive views on it. So I think that there is, despite the nativism that's coming out, the xenophobic reactions, despite Trump and some of his followers, I think the majority in the country are more favorable to immigration than we've seen in the past. What worries me is that we really don't know what the long-term effects on attitudes about immigration will be of this pandemic and the economic crisis that is associated with it, and whether the major steps towards regulating immobility, preventing people from moving. The fact, I must admit, to me, the fact that the Biden administration has not yet overturned the policy that it's using COVID as a reason for not allowing even asylum seekers to cross the border is disturbing, because it means that there is still, even within administration that has been awfully good on racial issues and on immigration and other respects, we're seeing some hesitancy about admitting that being in any situation where there may be an increase in people trying to come across the border, even while recognizing that the reasons that they're coming may be to flee some pretty bad situations, life-threatening ones, the other country. So I'm somewhat cautious about whether we're going to, how soon we're going to get through this period.
I guess if I could just say one thing, I know that if you look overall at the polling data on attitudes to immigration, they're quite positive. But when you break it down by political party, it's really striking. Republicans are really negative about immigration and on diversity issues, and that of course gets back to the polarization, as opposed to Democrats. So it really breaks down a lot over party lines, and given the dynamics of the political system and how it's structured partly in the United States. And I mean, after all, Trump won in 2016 and didn't get the majority vote. We have voter suppression. We have a not totally democratic Senate, the electoral college system. And we have a lot of problems. There are a lot of issues politically that help. I mean, there are a lot of structural issues that help the Republicans, right? Which, and I think there still is a lot of white, grievances and racial resentments among segments of the white population who will be very responsive to anti-immigrant rhetoric and discourse. So that makes me, I'm that's the sort of negative or the pessimistic view more of thinking about nativism. I mean, I think it helps that the Republicans get elected, and to the extent that they think it's going to help them, because that's what they want to talk about. I mean, I think it's not just immigration. I mean, I do think immigration is one of the issues, but it's combined really with racial issues. And of course, in this country, racial issues are not just about immigration. They're about African Americans. They're about long-term, Hispanics who've been living here, but mostly African Americans. And so a lot of what we see now with Republicans saying that they're going to go after these cultural issues, right, in the election. And I think that bodes ill, at least in the near term. So that in the long run, maybe it will be different because the population will shift, because younger people who are more liberal and more open to diversity may carry those attitudes with them as they grow older, because as more and partly because of the demographics and the opening up of positions at the top of the occupational ladder, we'll see more racial minorities moving into those positions. People will become more comfortable with seeing people in those positions who look different from them. Maybe race will fade into the background for many people on many occasions. We also have to think about in terms of the growth of the multiracial population, which is, the figures are really quite astounding. In 2015 of new marriages, 1 out of 6 new marriages were between people of different race and ethnicities, most a minority person with a white person. In 2017, 1/10 of births were infants with at least one white parent and one minority parent. So there's no guarantee. We don't know how those multiracial children will identify themselves or be seen by others. And again, to come back to the situation of African Americans, we know that those who have one Black parent and one white parent have much more difficulty establishing their identity as something other than Black or not as multiracial. But it's not inconceivable that with time, there will be maybe a multiracial category that people will think of. This is looking more optimistically about race, right? That there may be changes in perceptions of race. Racial prejudice and discrimination is not disappearing, but anytime soon, I think. But I think there may be more, maybe that will also have an impact. The changing racial perceptions and composition of the population may have some impact, perhaps, on attitudes towards immigration and race in general.
Thank you. Joel Teitelbaum's hand is up. If you would unmute yourself, please join us and pose a question.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I agree with most of what's been said. I'm much more interested in the demographic implications in numbers over time, to find out if the fact that at the present time, the United States population is not growing, it's almost flatlined due to increased death rates associated with COVID, but increasingly due to age structure, and decreased birth rates.
Mm-hmm.
What will the impact of immigration, or what has been the impact of immigration on birth rates and death rates and population growth over time in the US and parts of the US be?
That's a good question. Well, I'm not a demographer, but one thing is that there is over time, immigrants, this is the impact of the US on immigrants, right? Is over time, immigrant fertility rates begin to look more like those of long-established Americans. But still the fertility rates, for example, of Hispanics is still higher than it is for other groups. So maybe the immigrants will contribute to their fertility rates will mean an increase in the minority, if we want to call it that, racial populations over time. I'm not quite sure what the other issues that you were getting at in terms of how immigrants are going to affect fertility rates or demographics. it depends also on how many immigrants keep coming in, right?
We have a hand up by Leon Fink. Leon, unmute yourself. Join the conversation.
Well, Leon Fink.
Yes, hi, Nancy.
Hi, how are you?
Thank you. Very good. Thank you for your.
We have a link through a parental link, right?
Indeed.
My parental link.
Right. It's an honor. It's a very important family that you're a part of. In any case, my question is that it's clearly recognize the biggest villains out there when it comes to nativism. We can talk about the Trumpists and et cetera. But I'm wondering about the other end of the spectrum. What's your view of what should be a progressive policy towards immigration? I mean, obviously, even every progressive and social democratic government that I can think of in recent years has been somewhat buffeted by the immigration question. So it's not just when right wingers get control of the government. So if you were in charge, for example, of the Democratic Party policy on immigration,
Yes.
What would Nancy Foner's policy be?
Oh my gosh. Susan, I'm going to have to I don't really talk about this in the book, and on the whole, I think immigration is a good thing for America. So I would hope to see that there would be immigrants continue to come in, that we would have a generous policy for lawful permanent residents, that we will be generous to refugees, right? Here we are, we're talking today, right, in the midst of what's going on in the Ukraine, right? And we take in so few refugees relative to the enormous need. And the United States they would be a benefit to the country, because we're going to be short of labor, actually, in the future. And I think I think that we should have a more generous immigration policy, and we should certainly legalize immigrants. Now, undocumented immigrants, we should have a plan to legalize undocumented immigrants. That said, if I was president of the country, I would also be buffeted by various political pressures, but I'm not going to, and the ideal world, I think that is what I would support. Yeah.
Susan, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I can take the short answer, and that's read my book, A Nation of Immigrants, the second edition, that concludes with all of the recommendations I would make. I'm actually a hardliner in some respects on undocumented migration. I believe that there's a liberal reason to be worried about it, not least of which is what it does to the people who come in illegally and are subject to some of the labor practices that Nancy mentioned, who can't visit with their family, things of that sort. I think we need to do it in a humane way, and there has to be an out for people who really do have a fear of persecution, and not just return them without regard to their safety. But aside from that, I think that we probably do need to do with legalization again, because the numbers are just risen to the point where it's untenable, and we're talking about very long-term people. I think we need to do it incrementally, though. I think a large-scale, universal legalization at one time is probably not going to work very well. I think we need to identify segments like the DACA kids, some of the farm workers, groups where there's a higher level of consensus within the two parties that there's some deserving aspect to the legalization, and then work through other categories of people. I've put those who have temporary protection here in that that priority category. I think we have to have a much more flexible legal immigration system. The last time we reformed it was in 1990, and the economy has changed so profoundly since then. And that right now we manage the whole system through backlogs and waiting lists, not through priority setting as to who are the immigrants we want to admit through our legal channels. And I think we have to beef up our refugee program. We've seen it with the Afghans and with the now Ukrainians, that we don't have mechanisms for admitting people on a prompt basis, going through all of the security clearances, but in a way that allows us to rescue people when resettlement is a good way to help be our international burden sharing or responsibility sharing on that. And I think we need to start thinking much more seriously about climate change and the impacts on movements of people, and the way in which US policy needs to take that into account as it does persecution and conflict and other reasons. So in a nutshell, I think it's a lot we have to do, but I think we can do it a step at a time. I think the worst thing in the world is comprehensive immigration reform as the model, because that means getting nothing. We should be trying to get the pieces we can get and build up to a better future.
Increasingly, though, of course, it's almost impossible to get this through Congress. So inevitably, I guess it will come through various executive orders. I think.
Thank you. Michael Novak has been waiting patiently. Michael, join the conversation. If you unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My question is related to nativism and also to crime, because from what I remember, a lot of the in the old days, in the 1800s and early 1900s, a lot of the gangs that grew up in immigrant communities were at least partially initially formed as self-defense forces to protect against attacks by nativist groups. I'm wondering, in your research, do you see any correlation between levels of nativism and levels of crime or gang activity in immigrant communities? Does one cause the other, or is there no real relationship?
I really haven't seen anything on that, to be honest with you. What I do talk about in the book, and what social scientists write about, is the myth about immigrants creating a lot of crime, right? You hear President Trump, right? They come here, they're criminals, they're rapists. And the reality, which is that immigrants have very low rates of violent crime. In fact, if anything, they protect. It's helpful to live in it, and immigrant neighborhoods are safer neighborhoods. I mean, you can see there are reasons why immigrants don't create much, are not violent criminals. They come here to do better. They're a selected group. The ambitious, those who work hard, are the ones to come. They want to do better for themselves, their children. They're often sending money home. They don't want to be deported. They're vulnerable that way in terms of when they move to communities, often they revive them, and there are more eyes on the street. So actually, immigrants are associated with, they help us when it comes to crime, right? So, but I haven't seen anything about nativism and crime. No. I think nativism, well, maybe I should put it this way. I think nativist beliefs are myths often about crime. Nativists use these false images of immigrants, being these violent criminals, as a way to justify their prejudices, but they're often myths, and they exaggerate the levels of crime among immigrants, just as they did in the past. There were the images of Italians, with their stilettos, and that they came here. Well, there's crime among every group, but if you compare rates of crime, then you see that immigrants actually have lower rates of crime than native-born Americans.
Donald Rogers' hand is up. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you for allowing me to join you. I'm thinking about parallels between the current situation and immigration 100 years ago. 100 years ago, one of the consequences of immigration was the infusion of immigrants into working class and into the labor movement. Immigrants played a big role in the surge of the CIO in the 1930s. So I'm wondering now, does Professor Foner see increasing strength in the labor movement because of immigration now?
Well, of course, the labor movement isn't what it used to be, right? I mean, immigrants coming into the U.S., of course, 100 years ago, were coming at a time when labor unions were growing, where they were organizing and beginning to expand, right? As they did, especially during the 30s, as many of them were growing, were adults and in the workforce. So they were coming at a time when they were part of founding unions, right? And organizing and beginning to develop unions. Today, immigrants come to a US, of course, where labor unions have been greatly on the decline. However, that said, that many of them are working in service industries that are being organized, actually. Many of them, number one, many of them come into sectors of the economy that already have labor unions. Okay, so for example, and in cities where they're already organized. But there have been cases, for example, in Los Angeles, the janitors' strike is a classic one, right, where immigrants were organizing. They've also been involved in, I guess, worker centers like the Taxi Drivers Alliance, which is not a formal labor union, but it's a kind of workers center, is not involved in collective bargaining, but helps immigrants in terms of immigrant rights. So that, yes, I think that immigrants are maybe one of the hopes, I don't know, the hopes of some kind of organizing because of the industry, the sectors of the economy that they're in, and many service sector jobs. But to the extent that that all Americans have difficulties organizing, right, given much of the hostility of the government, many labor laws that have been changed, it's very difficult to organize workers. I think they suffer from that, but so maybe there's there's some ray of hope that they are organizable and have motivation to organize to improve their situation.
Thank you. From the Q&A, Deborah Cohen poses a question. She's concerned about the category of immigrant and how it papers over critical divisions around education, class, and language of immigrants. Could you speak to the ways that uneducated / lower skilled immigrant workers compete with uneducated domestic workers, white, blacks, Latinx, and Asian American?
There's a lot of different, I'm not quite sure what the question exactly is there, whether it's the category immigrant or the issue of competition that she's most concerned about.
I think it's two questions in one.
Yes.
So perhaps the first would be how the category of immigrant itself papers over the heterogeneity of those who come to the United States, papering over critical divisions around education, class, and language.
Okay, yes, I see what you mean. Yes, of course, the category immigrant is a pretty broad one, and it covers a lot of different kinds of people, right? It covers the surgeon who comes in, or the doctor who comes in, or an undocumented immigrant, or an immigrant who has, hardly any education and low skills and doesn't speak English, compared to an immigrant who is, highly educated and speaks English, yes, in terms of social class differences and human capital that they bring with them. So obviously yes, you're right. If you're looking at the impact that immigrants have, and also the impact that coming here has for immigrants, it matters a lot what their educational and social class background is, and of course how they do when they're in the United States. So you're absolutely right, and in making that point. So you raise again the issue of competition, and the economic literature does not look at particular cases. It's not looking at one factory and seeing what goes on there, or one place of work and whether there's competition. What it does is it looks at this big national data sets, right? And so it's looking at an overall picture. And so that doesn't mean that in some locations there's not competition and there's not cases where immigrants may lead to exacerbate the problem of wages for native-born workers. Okay, so that may happen. But at the same, so for example, you could have a situation, and this is what some of the reports mention. So for example, you may have immigrants competing with native-born workers for low-wage jobs, for example, in the kitchens, in restaurants, right? But by the same token, the fact that immigrants are working and keeping those restaurants going, they may create jobs for people in higher-level jobs within the same industry. So that's really what the economics are looking at. If you can get the, but there is some, yes, there is going to be some local-level competition, and of course, immigrants often. The question, they move into jobs often that native-born workers shun because the conditions are bad, the wages are bad. But what economists find often is that native-born workers shift out of those jobs, and it's not always that they're unemployed. They may go into other jobs, for example, jobs where language is more important. They may leave locations and move to better jobs, and not because of immigration, because they're rejecting the jobs that immigrants are taking. The other issue, by the way, that I did want to mention as we're talking about this, I didn't talk about the fact that immigrants, the downside for immigrants, I talked about this issue of competition, and that economists don't find that immigrants as a whole are taking jobs from native-born workers or competing with them for employment and lowering wages. But there is a downside we can't forget, and this came up earlier, but just to emphasize it again, that they're low-wage immigrant workers who move into many of the jobs that they do, suffer from bad conditions and unhealthy conditions and unsafe conditions. They often make low wages and have and very difficult jobs. And so we can't forget that. And one other question, which I didn't discuss also, maybe to raise here, is the question is, why are immigrants taking these jobs? Why are they willing to do it? And why do employers often prefer them? And they take the jobs often because they're coming here they make more money, even in low wage, jobs than they could make in their home country. They come because often they see their stay as temporary. They take the jobs often because they're sending money home, which is a very important part of their household income in their home country. And they take them because they often have no choice. Many of them don't speak English. They have low levels of education. They're not eligible. Undocumented immigrants are eligible for virtually no social benefits, welfare benefits, and lawful permanent residents are not eligible for most of these benefits until they've been here 5 years or more. So they don't have a choice. So I think the combination of all of these factors mean that many immigrants are willing, I need the word willing, okay, take jobs that native-born Americans would not take. And at the same time, we should, and also another element is that many immigrants who come here take jobs that are way below their levels of education. They're downwardly occupationally mobile because they don't often speak English, because they come at ages where it's very difficult to get into the labor market with the skills that they have, and because they can't meet licensing requirements. And so we have a situation where many immigrants who have relatively high levels of education are doing low-level work, particularly when they initially come. When I got into the immigration field, I should say, by studying Jamaicans, that was my first research. I was actually initially an anthropologist, and I did a study. Yes, I worked I did field work for 1.5 years in a Jamaican village, and then I studied Jamaicans in New York and in London. And the woman that I lived with in this Jamaican village was a teacher. She was very respected in her community. She came to the United States to make money to send her daughter to university in Jamaica. But when she came to this country, she was a live-in caregiver for an old woman, a very elderly old woman. She had a horrible job. I kept on thinking, why are you taking this horrible job? I mean, it was really a bad job. It was very low paid. And the thing that actually bothered her the most about this job is that she at that time was undocumented, and she couldn't tell the woman that she lived with that she had been a teacher. Nobody, their employer didn't know that at all. And, it was really a bad job, but she was working at this job because she saw it as temporary. She wanted to send the money to her daughter within her own community in New York, because she spent one day a week living on her day off for her people that she knew in Queens. They recognized that she was a teacher. That was the status that she had. So just to give you a sense, I mean, and over time, actually, she did stay in the US, but she got better jobs, but they were all elder care jobs, which were much lower in status than anything she had done. And this is another way I should say that Americans benefit from immigrants, right? They have people who were teachers in their home country doing elder care jobs, so that we have, which, by the way, is another issue for the United States as the population ages, right? In terms of immigrants' role, is who is going to take care of all of us, or many of you when we get older. Because that's an issue, because those are heavily immigrant jobs. So I've gotten a bit off the topic, but the question led to some of those issues.
So let me raise a question that Robert Sciaretta has posed in the Q&A. And you touched on the last point in his list, but he says it's wonderful to hear about the benefits of immigration and their offspring. Does your book examine the costs and strain on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, schools, and the criminal justice system? I think you've talked a little bit about the crime issue, but the others, the strain.
It doesn't look at the issue of the impact on welfare benefits, on Medicare or Medicaid. There is literature on that, which again shows, forgetting the fact that immigrants pay into the system too, through everything they buy with sales taxes, but also with paying income taxes, including, by the way, many undocumented immigrants. So when there are analyses of the cost benefits of how much immigrants use services that are provided by the government versus how much they pay in. And of course, we know that many immigrants, and this again relates to undocumented immigrants, are afraid to use services for which they're even eligible or their children are eligible. There was a study done in New York, actually, of parents, undocumented parents whose children were US citizens, and many of them were not going to get the benefits that their children were eligible for because they were afraid. And we certainly know with the public charge rule, which was one of the rules that Trump put into the way he put it into effect, which would have penalized immigrants who had received certain benefits and made it more difficult for them and those they sponsored to come legally to the US, that they weren't applying for, they were afraid to apply for benefits that even they were eligible for. So I think the evidence shows that actually immigrants on the whole contribute more than they take. I think that, Susan, maybe you have more that you want to say on that.
Yeah, there's a maldistribution, though, in terms of who pays for the costs versus who benefits. So the benefits are almost all at the national level. Federal government benefits, Social Security, as you mentioned, actually benefits from undocumented migration because they're paying into Social Security very often, but they never are eligible to receive the benefits. So the federal government comes out fairly well. The costs tend to be at the state and local level, and how much of a cost there is depends on a lot of factors, including how well educated the immigrants are. And Nancy's book shows that over time, we have been seeing a much higher level of education to the point where there is a large segment of the immigrant population that is as or better educated than the best of natives are on that. So that means more revenue is coming in. But yes, at the local level, there very often are strains and costs of adaptation. I think the policy response, rather than being let's stop immigration, should be how do we distribute this overall national benefit to the states and localities that do need help in dealing with the changing population and what the costs are of that, particularly to the education system. And I don't think we've done well enough in addressing where those costs are and make sure that all of the people who benefit overall from immigration are helping those communities that have particular problems or costs that they have to deal with.
Yeah, just to give the figures to people have an idea, about a third of all immigrants in the U.S. have a BA or more. That's really high. And at the other end, about a little over a quarter don't have a high school diploma. So it's a kind of bimodal distribution, but a third is a lot. And increasingly over time, as we see in terms of entries of lawful permanent residents, the immigrants coming in are more highly educated. The rates are very pronounced, they're very notable.
So I want to get a question myself, if I can.
Sure.
And I want to return to the question of nativism, which, as historians know, is not the same thing in all periods of time. And so in your book, you raised the issue of the know-nothings in the 1850s, the anti-Catholicism that drove them. At the turn of the century, the American Federation of Labor saw new immigrants as both an economic and a cultural threat. The 1924 Immigration Restriction Act was just seeped in racial thinking, in which different immigrant groups occupied different positions in a racial hierarchy. You fast forward to, and you mentioned him in the beginning of the book, Samuel Huntington, who back in 2004 did something of a screed of sorts, Who Are We?, in which he saw America's cultural heritage, under strain or attack. And then we can fast forward to today with the world of Trump and Tucker Carlson and so many others, whose nativism is, in a sense, kind of weaponized. And there's an economic dimension, but it's very heavily culturally based. Could you talk about the changes in nativism and just explore a little bit more about what drives Trump or Carlson or others who have weaponized nativism in this way today?
Well, I mean, it's political, obviously, and by the way, there are obviously differences in nativism at different points. Part what they're aiming for, in the appeals particular appeals that they make, right? So obviously there are differences. But today, I think it's a very blatant political attempt to mobilize particular parts of the white population who have a lot of racial resentments against Native minorities and immigrants. And I think that's what they're doing. I mean, as a way to get them. I mean, they're finding that I guess it has an appeal. I don't know what they think particularly themselves about these groups, but they find that using it is a very successful way to mobilize support. And so they're using it. Now they're not, they don't come with particular platforms like the know-nothings, right? And they're not running on that issue alone, right? It's a way which makes a difference, right? The know-nothings have particular platform about naturalization, for example, right? The Republican Party today barely has a political platform about any issue, right? In fact, that's one of the points, right, about they're vague on a lot of these questions. So they don't have a plank in which they say, if we get elected, we're going to do such and such about immigration, right? Well, Trump said he was going to build a wall, right? Okay, that was, I guess, a plank, right? That he was going to build the wall with Mexico and get them to pay for it. We have yet to see what, he didn't actually use immigration as much in the 2020 campaign, right? When he got elected, the Muslim ban, but he doesn't say that that's what he's going to do. I mean, it's not an overt, party plank to do something. They're just, I think the more of it is a use of anti-immigrant and it's a racial message, right, of America, for particularly religious, evangelical Christians, for non-college educated whites who are feeling left behind, who have suffered from globalization and deindustrialization, who feel that America is no longer the America they know, not just because there are more immigrants, but also because of the women's movement, because of the gay liberation, whatever you want to, the acceptance of LGBTQ people, which of course they probably wouldn't even use that phrase and don't like it. And so I think it's a bunch of changes that they feel that they want to go back to the 1950s. And of course, the 1950s was a time when immigrants weren't coming here. There had been a very low immigration for a very long time. In 1960, less than 5% of the country was immigrant, foreign born, and immigrants were under 10 million people. Compare that to today, from 10 million, right, to 45 million, from under 5% to 14%. So that's been a big change. And not only that, there's been a dispersion of immigration. So it's not as concentrated in traditional gateways. So it's all over the country. It's, so now, maybe another optimism, right? This is not nativism. This is some optimism, all right? Many studies show that interaction between people of different races and ethnic groups, it leads to at least accommodation, to becoming used to people who are different, and reduces prejudice and conflict. And so perhaps as immigrants spread around the country, and we find that often the most prejudice and the most is in places where there are the fewer immigrants, okay? So as people have more interaction with people who are different from them racially and in terms of national origin background, maybe that will lead to more civil or at least accommodations and acceptance of diversity and comfort with diversity, and more interaction in schools, in workplaces, in neighborhoods. And so maybe that's another, if we're looking for an optimism here, that there may be more optimism, that make it signs of optimism in terms of actual on the ground interactions as we have more diverse communities. And again, the group that has the highest rates of residential segregation from whites are Blacks, whether they're immigrants or not immigrants, native born and foreign born alike. And so that doesn't bode so well for that. I mean, that's again an issue where Asian Americans and Hispanics or Latinos tend to have more interaction, given their residential patterns at least.
I'm just curious, and perhaps we can close on this, on the political front, looking at the recent Virginia elections, where race was a prominent issue with Glenn Youngkin railing against critical race theory. And that apparently, drove some voters to the polls to cast their ballots for him. And at the same time that the Republican Party has weaponized nativism, he has a diverse team, African American, Hispanic, as part of his administration elected with him. So you both have diversity in Republican ranks coinciding with anti-immigration and especially anti-critical race theory. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think the Republicans will make more efforts to have more diverse people running for office because they see that as a way to perhaps get more of the minority vote. However, if you look at the whole, they don't have that many, and their electoral base. And now they do have some minorities. I mean, it's not that there are no racial minorities voting Republican. There are some who do, but they're way outnumbered by whites, and whites are the overwhelming dominant group, much more so than the Democratic Party. But yeah, you point to an interesting dynamic, right? They're going to use these racist, which is what they are, right? messages to try to motivate white voters. And the critical race theory is also an attempt to get more white suburban voters, right, who have defected to who've been more, especially women, right, concerned about school. I mean, their messages are very politically, organized to help improve their votes among those who they want to get to vote. I think we're going to see much more of that. And I also think you're right. We're going to see more of them trying to recruit minorities to run for office and an attempt to try to get the minority vote. But of course, people don't just vote for someone who looks like them, right? Or we have to hope that the Democrats will also get that message out, right? That it's not just having someone who's from your national origin group or racial group running for office, but it's also what they're promising and what they say.
Thank you. I unfortunately have to draw this session to a close since it's now past 5:30. So my thanks to Nancy Foner and Susan Martin for this stimulating conversation. And I invite those of you who are watching to come back and join us on Monday, March 7th at 4 p.m. when the Washington History Seminar returns to discuss Jason Steinhauer's just published book, History Disrupted: How Social Media and the World Wide Web Have Changed the Past, with discussant Catherine Kramer Brownell of Purdue University and the Washington Post's Made for History. With that, I want to thank you, wish you all a good night. Please stay safe.